Professor Koos Malan is a former professor of public law, and he's currently a fellow at Sakeliga. So, Professor, what's very interesting to me is a lot of analysts, they criticize South Africa's current position, but then they say the constitution is so great. And they don't seem to see the contradiction there. I mean, a lot of the problems stem from the constitution. If you're saying the president has too much power, that problem is in the constitution. So why do you think people don't see that contradiction?
Well, I think a tremendous amount of trust has been invested in the Constitution back in 1994 when the interim Constitution entered into force, and thereafter the so-called final Constitution. We can speak about the so-called final. A tremendous amount of trust was invested in that, actually believing that it was something like a miracle. As a matter of fact, it was actually something like a religious event. The entering into force of the Constitution was seen as something which was miraculous. It was a religious event. In other words, a lot of faith was put in that. And if once you are faithful, you stick to your faith. And this is what has been happening. This also comes against the background of the following. Back in 1993, that very important book by Francis Fukuyama was written, The End of History. That was the beginning of the title, The End of History and the Last Man. And in a sense, the events in South Africa in the middle of the last decade of the 20th century was a very important indication of the so-called end of history and the last man. Why? Well, the idea was that the phenomenon of a variety of civilizations has come to an end. We are all only individuals. We only have individual rights. We only have individual identity. We're not Westerners. We're not Africans. We're not Asians. We're not Chinese. We're not Muslims. We're not Christian. We're not Afrikaners or Germans or English or Zulu or whatever. We're just generally humans. That was the end of history. In a nutshell, that is what Fukuyama meant by the end of history. So, in other words, if you adopt a constitution, and if a constitution pretends to be supreme, what the South African constitution is in fact doing, it pretends to be supreme. And if you have a full catalogue of individual rights, then you basically cater for everything. Because everything else that could come into play, namely a variety of civilizations or a class of civilizations, which Huntington spoke about, or a variety of identities, well, that is ruled out as simply completely irrelevant. Not only irrelevant, but that it is actually non-existing. It doesn't exist. And what has happened in the meantime is that we have seen the tremendous rise of identity in world politics, and of identity also arising, question of identity arising also in domestic politics in a large number of states. And I'm not referring to identity politics, this crazy woke kind of ideologies. I'm referring to cultural identities, civilizational identities, which has its anchors in history. That has come to the fore in the last 2-3 decades very, very potently. And it's something that you cannot deny. It has also come to the fore in South Africa, where clearly in South Africa you have something like a class of civilizations between the West on the one hand, and something like a kind of an African civilization which struggles finding its feet, actually, but there is something like that. Some of my previous colleagues at the University of Pretoria call it Zanianism, and you see a clash between that, between a Zanianism on the one hand and a Western culture, Western civilization on the other. Now, if those are the main forces determining the nature of politics, and I think it's becoming more and more important in South Africa, then clearly this liberal ideology, more correctly put, liberal religion, actually, then that is proven to be completely wrong. That is proven to be completely out of kilter with what is happening in states, in society. And I think so much, as I've said, faith has been invested in the just generally humanitarian, if you want to put it that way, ideology, so much trust has been invested in that no room was left for various identities, and with that actually coming up and coming to the fore and being emphasized, this is just people who have invested so much in general liberal ideology simply doesn't want to accept these old realities who have come to exert themselves now in present day South Africa, Europe, well, all over the world, as a matter of fact.
Is that why you said in your article, recent article in BizNews, indeed the belief in equality has gained so much acceptance that leading Western states, in fact, do not view themselves as Western any longer? I think you also referenced a quote from Bill Clinton, where he said that we need a revolution in the United States to overcome this, to make way for this new ideology. What's the story there?
Yeah, a little bit of background. Let me refer to Huntington. I've already mentioned his name. But Huntington wrote his a very important book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, back in, I think it was 1997. And in that book, he basically said that, basically argued that civilizations, a multitude of civilizations, has always been the main factor determining the course of world politics. And he basically distinguished between Western Christian civilization, not that it's that Christian anymore, but let's leave that aside for the moment. Basically, Western civilization with its bases in Western Europe, North America, in Australasia, and also with a footprint, obviously, in South Africa. That's first, and then secondly, Islam, obviously, and then thirdly, a Russian civilization, more correctly, Orthodox civilization, Chinese civilization, Japanese civilization, and then also, obviously, Indian civilization, Hindu, in which find its cradle in India. He's a little bit not that certain what to make at that stage. When he wrote the book, he was not that clear about Africa. Said, well, as far as South Africa is concerned, a next generation, as he said, of African leadership might not be that content anymore with the Constitution, with the 1996 Constitution. That's what he predicted. He was absolutely spot on. He was right. And they would tend to yearn for an own identity which set itself apart from Western civilization. That's what Huntington said. And then later on, coming closer to your question, is Huntington also in 2003 published a book, Who Are We? As a matter of fact, it's just here at the back, one of the books I kept closest to me. Who Are We? And Who Are We spoke to the American society. And Huntington, especially the first part of the book, wrote about the specifically Christian Western civilization as the salient feature of the American state. And he proved it in much detail. Now, what we've seen, especially after the Second World War, and more so after the 1960s, beginning in around about 1964, 65, and so on, was that America was increasingly viewed as actually something different, namely as a kind of a world nation. Everybody was welcome in the United States on the basis of the fact that you were an individual, subscribing to individual rights, regardless of your cultural identity. And that is actually, according to Huntington, a novelty. It is not true that America has always been this kind of global state. This is a novelty. This is entirely new. Now, what has happened is that this new idea of making of the United States something completely different than it used to be for 2-3 centuries, that is something that is playing out now in the United States, and which boils down to a class of civilizations which is actually playing out in the US now. The Huntington wrote in the previous book that I referred to, the Class of Civilizations, he wrote about the boundaries. That's where, say, Western Christian civilization as for a period of 1,000 years or more, met Islam civilization. Those were, for a long period, those were bloody borders, as a matter of fact. No question about that. But you don't find something like that within a civilization. You would not find something like that within Western Europe. Had there been battles in Western Europe, it would be internal religious battles, such as between Catholicism and Protestantism, or ideological battles such as in the 1930s and 1940s between National Socialism and its opposition, or national battles between France and Germany also. But you don't find this much more deeper seated ideological, or rather civilizational battles. You also won't find a civilizational battle in the United States. But what has now been happening in the United States, as a result of the fact that that there are many people now within the US who defines the US in a different way, this civilizational battle has arisen in the United States itself.
So, sorry, Koos, do you think that's perhaps because of their foreign intervention, that it's sort of it has built guilt into the United States leadership, that they now believe, they're now starting also to advocate for this liberal ideology, and also now why people see United States not just as a country, but as a civilization idea, because they're spread around the world.
Well, you see, when one uses the word civilization, there are essentially two ways in which you can use it. You can use civilization simply as an opposite for barbarism, or you can use civilization, the word civilization, with a very specific meaning, referring to a civilization of a specific kind, Western civilization, Islamic civilization, and so on and so forth. So what you had in the US, it was at the forefront. It was, in a sense, the leader of the Western civilization, at least since the 1940s. But what has been happening in the United States, it's that there's now within the United States a civilizational clash. Back in, I can't remember the specific date, but it was back in the 1990s, 1980s rather, there was this urge at some of the universities, that the subject, which was very peculiar to all American universities, US universities, a typical salient feature of them, they gave the subject Western civilization. West Civ, that's how it was called for short. And then a number of Africanist figures actually objected to that and said, ho, Western civilization must go. And this formed the basis of the pressure that was placed upon many American universities to actually get rid of those courses. Now, this struggle is now finally playing out in the United States, resulting in the United States actually becoming a cleft state, in the same way as South Africa, for example, is also a cleft state, in that is a state in which a variety, at least two, as a matter of fact, at least civilizations meet, as a result of which you have a civilizational struggle. So what is playing out now in the United States is a civilizational struggle. That is what is happening. Precisely as a result of a considerable amount of people in the US coming from different cultures, coming from different civilizations, coming from Islam, and so on and so forth, who obviously are not content with the United States viewing itself as a Western state. Now, liberal politicians and statesmen such as Clinton obviously embraced the idea of America having to rid itself of its civilizational character. And precisely as a result of that, already back in, 20 years ago, Clinton already rejected the idea of the United States seeing itself as a Western power, a Western state, a state with a Western civilizational character. The reason for American politics having become so acrimonious, where the animosities are so deep, is precisely as a result of that, because it is a civilizational clash which is now playing out in the United States. And in a sense, in South Africa, something of the same kind is playing out here. Even though I think, strangely enough, the chances of sorting that out in South Africa might be better than in the United States. The acrimonious clashes that you have in the United States are just unimaginable.